Snyder. Oh, Reed! Where on earth did he find that one from?
Gyökeres!
Forward through for Krupi. Chance here! Salah for Liverpool. And there finally is the goal. Arsenal have won this game. Gabriel's header.
In 2026, the champions are the Arsenal.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, EPL Index proudly brings to you the best prediction podcast in the world, A Tad Predictable. With your host, Tadiwa Chanakira.
For Liverpool. And there finally is the goal. Arsenal have won this game. Gabriel's
Hello, and welcome to A Tad Predictable podcast. Obviously, slightly different from the other 227 episodes that we have had in the past. They were all audio. We have moved with the times, so they say. We've moved now to YouTube, so we're going to be video and audio. For audio listeners, we're not going anywhere. We just want to bring another element to the show, and what a better way to start this off with than diving into the topics that we want to be talking about today. Because, I mean, we look at the fact that preseason was pretty much done as of the Community Shield. That's kind of the grand ceremonial end to preseason. Everyone is now focused on what can their team do in the English Premier League. And you look at that preseason, all of a sudden the Premier League stops being that noise in the background that you have, and it starts becoming a story. However, at the beginning of that story, there are usually a lot more questions than answers. Are Tottenham waking up from that huge 2-year slumber? Are Brighton still the smartest club in Europe? Was Brentford's aggressive approach on the pitch something to pay attention to this season? Have perhaps Chelsea figured out how to function as an actual football club and not as some sort of football manager save, some FIFA save? I'm always going to call it FIFA. It's like I'm always going to call it Twitter, right? Last but not least, I also want to touch on the fact that that transfer market, the fees that are going on at the moment, what is that about? Is it about numbers still? Or is it about a message that you're sending out to the rest of the league, to your fans, to clubs around the world about who you are and what you represent? Now, this next season looks like it's going to be a bit chaotic. You look at the big money that's being spent. You look at the big swings that are being taken. You look at the big consequences. From last season, managers have gone left, right, and center. Nearly half the league has new managers in place. So obviously that has an effect as well. So how is that going to materialize? How is that going to impact how this league goes? But that's what we do here on A Tad Predictable. That's what we do here on EPL Index, finally on YouTube. And what we do is we try and make the Premier League a little bit more relatable. We try and make it make a little bit more sense. And there's no better place to start when trying to make things make sense than with Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, because you look at Tottenham and you look at the fact that they have had almost 2 years of just absolute slumber. 2 years of, are they going to, are they not going to? And I think it's important for us to contextualize what they were, what they are, and what they're hoping to become. Because for Tottenham Hotspur, they're that team that you see in every league across the world, where they have to hit rock bottom in order to wake up. Whether or not Spurs are the team that actually do wake up, obviously their fans are desperately hoping for. Relegation dogfight last season, as Neil Caldwell says, it wasn't even as though, you know, Spurs had just one season like that. It was more than one season. It was 2 seasons that Spurs had like that. And you look at the fact that Spurs were a football club that is one of the 10th richest clubs in world football. They're a global brand. a Champions League hopeful team that's hoping to be in the Champions League each season. I know for some of their fans, it's, expecting to be title challengers. More power to you if you feel that way. I think objectively speaking, Spurs being a team that's in and around those Champions League battles for a couple of seasons is probably the most realistic target they should have. And then you build from there. We've seen other teams do that, but that's not to say they can't go and win the league this season, because everyone starts with 0 points. Everyone can go and win the league this season. But for Tottenham, I think it's about course correcting, because this wasn't just a football problem. I thought this was a club problem. It was a structural problem. You had mismanagement right at the top. You had recruitment that didn't really quite fit. And a part of that we're going to talk about later on when we talk about the manager in De Zerbi coming in and the amount of years that they've given him in his contract. But I also think from a Spurs perspective, not only did they, as Neil Caldwell mentioned, were in a relegation battle, they didn't even flirt with relegation. I can't call it flirting with relegation, because at one point they started full on dating relegation. They moved in with relegation. There was word around the streets that they had bought a ring and were ready to propose to relegation. And then on the last day of the season, the Premier League ends up stealing them back. So they're back for another season. And as I said, that it can't get more rock bottom than that. Maybe relegation is the rock bottom that they needed, but I don't think they necessarily needed to get relegated in order for them to then realize what needs to be done, how they need to fix it, and that they do actually need to go and fix the issues that they were having. So where does that leave Spurs? How do they go about doing that? Well, the first thing they looked to address was the manager. Roberto De Zerbi comes in towards the back end of last season. But the interesting thing for them is he gets a 5-year contract. And I'm hoping for their sake, we know De Zerbi's record with teams, he doesn't stay long. But I'm hoping for their sake, the fact that they've given him a 5-year contract, they, as much as they can, honor that 5-year contract. And what I mean by that is you got to let the players know that this is our manager. We're not letting him go. You either buy into what he wants you to do or you move on, and be respectful about that situation. Because I think at times Spurs have become kind of like what Chelsea were for a couple of seasons, especially, when the John Terrys were there, where not that Chelsea aren't doing it now, but it was more prominent then, where players were dictating whether or not managers could stay. And I don't think that's always a healthy situation to be in as a football club. If the players solely are dictating, all right, we don't really feel this manager, we're not necessarily going to put in the effort. And it's usually just, the hierarchy in that group. I think it's better when a club holistically is deciding whether a manager is staying or going, with input from the players, with sometimes input from the fans. I know fans, we wish we had more impact on that, more influence on that. I don't necessarily know how much of an influence we do have. Some might say a great deal. I would argue not as great a deal as we think we do have. But as I said, holistically, as a club, you want to be changing the manager. So they've given him 5 years. Hopefully that gives him the platform to implement what he wants to implement, to bring in the players he wants to bring in, to mold the squad to his philosophy. Because we've seen it with Spurs. They will hire a manager. He will bring in a couple of signings. They'll fire that manager. The new manager comes in. He wants his own signings. And then they'll fire him. And you end up with this melting pot of a squad that doesn't necessarily gel together. A lot of that Spurs team had technical players, maybe not enough grit players. You end up with overlapping players that play in similar positions but are all demanding a start, which kind of dampens the ability for the manager to shape the squad in different ways. You're kind of limited and handicapped by what you can do as the manager. And with regards to their transfer philosophy as a whole, if you go back to when we were still audio, right? A couple of episodes back, I did break down my thoughts on Spurs's approach to the transfer window. Very briefly, I'll mention it here, but definitely go back and listen if you want the full context of it. Effectively, it felt like Spurs were hampered by what they had taken on from a financial perspective with building the stadium. And we know from Arsenal and from Arsene Wenger, full disclosure, I may be a Liverpool fan, but Arsene Wenger is my favorite manager of all time. I don't know how that works. It just does. But when Arsene Wenger was at Arsenal, he was restricted with what he could do with the wage bill and to an extent the transfer fees that he could pay for players, but specifically the wage bill. And Arsenal were also limited by what they could do if Wenger were to leave. He was kind of pretty much stuck at Arsenal. He couldn't leave for a certain period of time because the funders wanted a certain level of security. Spurs didn't have that type of person from a manager perspective. They didn't have an Arsene Wenger at the helm when they built the new Tottenham Stadium that I'll affectionately call the Hot Toddy. They didn't have anyone, right, as a manager to be that person that takes that mantle. What they did have is chairman, so to speak, Levy, right? I think he took on that inverted commas Arsene Wenger role where he had to stay at the club for a certain period of time, because whatever Spurs fans think of him as a manager, him as a businessman is a different thing. Him as, generating commercial revenue for Spurs was a different thing, right? Him as what he's giving the player, the tools he's giving the managers, transfers and player personnel and who people want to be in the squad and out of the squad and bought and sold. Maybe not so much in favor with the fans, but you can't deny from a commercial perspective, he was really, really good. And I think the funders for the stadium had to put obviously limitations on what Spurs could do from a spending perspective, go and look what Spurs were paying in transfer fees versus what they were paying in wages at the time. And then also look at the fact that when Levy finally leaves, the years kind of match up with how long those securities usually last for. So I wouldn't be surprised if down the road we eventually hear something about that with regards to Spurs. I see Neil's mentioning Son was amazing for Spurs. Son is my wife's favorite player. So I agree with you there. And I personally wanted him at Liverpool before he joined Tottenham. So I've always had a soft spot for Son. I think he's a great player. Well, Spurs now have the manager. They're now spending big money in transfers and they're paying big wages in transfer, with regards to players as well. Whether or not they've overpaid, I think it's fair to say they have overpaid for Sandro Tonali. I think they've overpaid for Matheus Fernandes, but you're only worth what someone's willing to pay for you. And for Spurs fans, that's not your job to worry about the accounts. It's not your job to worry about the finances. All you have to worry about is the player personnel. Are these players going to come in and improve what we have, or are they not? I think in midfield, they've done a phenomenal job. Sandro Tonali, Matheus Fernandes comes in. They bring a bit of steel. They bring a bit of grit, which I think was missing from that Spurs team. They bring quite a lot of energy. I think Spurs did have energy in midfield, to be fair to them. But I do like that pairing to sort of bring a bit more protection to that back line. And I think they're going to need that protection because I'm not as happy with what they've done defensively or in goal. We'll start straight at the back in goal. Obviously, Vicario goes. You've got Kinski. You've got Dubravka who comes in, and he'll be the number 2. He's okay, I guess, as a backup that you hope never gets to play, because if he does, I think Spurs would be in serious trouble. I think Kinski has shown great resolve from obviously the incident that happened with him in Europe against Atletico, and for him to come back from that, and you saw the amazing saves he made on the final day of the season. Full credit to him. I applaud him for that, and I hope that he continues to progress as a first team goalkeeper. I still have questions if he is a goalkeeper that you can have if you have aspirations of winning the Premier League title in a couple of years' time. But again, for what Spurs are right now, I hope I'm not being disparaging by saying this. I think Spurs' main focus is getting back into the Champions League or getting back into European football in some form or fashion. We've seen teams, yes, struggle and be close to relegation. Spurs have the added benefit in that they are one of the traditionally big six clubs. So yes, they've had 2 rotten years, but I still think as quickly as they went into those 2 rotten years, if they fix things, they can shoot up the table quite quickly as well. And they're trying to address that with their transfers. They're trying to address that with the type of manager they've brought in, giving him long-term assurity. But the goalkeeping situation, as I said, for title contention, not for me right now. The play is right now challenging for Europe. I think he's a good enough goalkeeper to achieve that. Defensively, I think Porro is fantastic at the right back situation. You then obviously lose Romero, which is frustrating if you're a Spurs fan, I'd imagine. He is a quality player, a bit too aggressive at times, but if you take that aggression out of his game, does he lose who he is? Does he lose a bit of his confidence and all of that stuff? So you kind of have to take the red cards with who he is as a player. We take that on board. Van de Ven obviously was his partner. He's still at the club. Fantastic news for Spurs. The injury record for him is the big concern, which is why you bring in a Senesi. I think Senesi on a free transfer is a brilliant signing. You bring him in, if he's the 3rd choice center back, if he's not the starter, if you say, okay, we're going to start Van Hecke and Van de Ven, right? And Senesi can come in, obviously rotation. Not everyone's going to play 38 games in a season. Virgil van Dijk. You're going to rotate your squads, and centre backs is no different in that sense. So I think he's a phenomenal player, especially on a free transfer. Van Hecke defensively, I think there are questions with regards to him. Offensively, I think he's going to help build up play quite well. But again, defensively, there are issues. But hopefully, the fact that they've brought a bit more structure ahead of them with Sandro Tonali and Fernandes coming into to those midfield slots, hopefully it doesn't require him to be an absolute magician from a defensive perspective. And then the system helps them defend rather than necessarily counting on the talents of individual defenders and their defensive traits. But as I said, playing on the ball, helping with building up play, I think it's a great signing for them. Then you got Andy Robertson coming in at left back. As a Liverpool fan, I was one of those Liverpool fans that's been a bit critical of Andy Robertson for probably the last 2 years. And it's quite simple. Andy Robertson is a Liverpool great. Nothing will change that. He's one of the best left backs to ever play for Liverpool, one of the best left backs to ever play in the Premier League, especially when there was that tandem with him and Trent Alexander-Arnold on either flank. They were competing with each other for the assists record. He's got one of, his record speaks for himself. What he did on the pitch speaks for himself. The human being he is off the pitch speaks volumes above what he is on the pitch. I can tell you that much. He's a phenomenal person. Age catches up with everybody, and it doesn't catch up with everyone equally. So some people will look at an Andy Robertson and say, well, he's not 40, so you can't really be calling him old. Well, he's not in his late 30s, you can't really be calling him old. You have to look at how many minutes they've played. You have to look at the type of minutes they were playing. You have to look at what they were being required to do in those minutes at those points in time. And unfortunately for Andy Robertson, Liverpool rinsed every inch, every ounce they could out of him in terms of output. It was the same for Scotland. He played every minute for Scotland pretty much. For Liverpool, he's playing pretty much every minute. And the amount of running he was being asked to do for Liverpool, he had to be offensively sound to keep up with, the assist competition he had with Trent. And defensively, he was the more responsible defender when you look at between him and Trent. So he was a marathon runner up and down the pitch for Liverpool. That's taken its toll on him. And the reason I bring that up is that, yes, every now and then, I do believe Robertson can still give you a vintage Andy Robertson performance. But if you listen to ex-players and when you speak to ex-players, what they'll say is, yes, I can give you that performance every once in a while. I can't give it to you week in, week out like I used to. And that's the problem for Robertson. I don't think he can give that level of performance that people are expecting from him week in, week out. I still think every now and then he can bring it out. I hope Spurs rotate him properly to give him enough time to recharge and reset and get back into things. But they can't be expecting him to play on the weekend and then play Champions League football midweek, or a Carabao Cup game in Spurs' situation, Champions League when it was Liverpool's situation, a Carabao Cup game midweek, an FA Cup game, on the back of a weekend game or something like that. You're going to have to limit how much you play him. And even with Spurs' inverted commas lesser schedule than what he would be expected to have at Liverpool this season, I still think you have to rotate him a little bit because, again, there's a lot of tread on those tires. So I'm not as high on him as Spurs as many people are on the pitch. I do think off the pitch he's invaluable because remember what we're talking about. Spurs went to rock bottom. Remember, Robertson came from Hull, who had been relegated from the Premier League when he came to Liverpool. So he knows what it's like to fight that relegation battle. He didn't successfully climb out of that battle with Hull, but he does have that experience. He's got the experience of everything he's done at Liverpool. He knows what it takes to be a champion. Hopefully he brings that to Spurs, and I have no doubt that he's going to bring that type of attitude to Spurs. He's going to try and help the players set a standard in training, and that can only mean good things for them. But again, on the pitch is where I don't know if maybe the levels that people are expecting from him are necessarily the levels that we're going to get. As Neil mentions, Robertson is great in the dressing room. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Off the pitch, in the dressing room, in training, when standards slip, he's going to be the one to tell people. And the brilliant thing with Robertson, I'll add this bit, and then we can move on. The brilliant thing with Andy Robertson is that he knows when to lighten the mood. He knows when to make things serious. He knows when to hold people accountable. He's very good at that balancing act. If you listen to a lot of Liverpool players, if you talk to Liverpool players, Robertson is the one that will crack a joke when the team needs, that mood to lighten because it's a bit tense. That's going to be a world of good for Spurs' team to have someone that knows when to do that. Because sometimes teams have a lot of players that don't know when to do that. Then they're cracking jokes when it's not time to crack jokes. It's time to be serious. It's time to put in a graft. It's time to put in work on the training pitch. Robertson is going to help with that. So I 100% agree with Neil. Robertson is going to be great in the dressing room. But as I said, defensively, I think that's where the questions for Spurs, they got to hope that the system helps them defend rather than necessarily counting on individual players, because I think there are some questions in that back line with the goalkeeper in terms of how solid they can be defensively. But that, we saw good performances from Spurs. We saw not so good performances in preseason, but they weren't the only team that was up and down. I thought preseason, and we're going to head into talking about preseason next, I thought preseason was quite chaotic this season in the Premier League. Obviously, you're coming off the back of a World Cup. So some players are coming late. Some players, obviously, you get those players that come in early to show the commitment. And nowadays, pretty much all players are training in their holiday time, whether or not they post it on Instagram or X, largely on Instagram. Whether or not they post it on Instagram, trust me, the vast majority of them are doing it. Gone are the days where you literally are off for the entire preseason. Then you come back to preseason to get fit for the season. That's not the case. These players have objectives that they have to meet during off season, so that when they get back to the season, they're at a certain level that they can then catapult themselves into the season. That's what football has become. And I think it's for the better I think it makes obviously the intensity levels higher, even though it looks like, oh, it's preseason. The first couple of games in the season, obviously on Friday, we're going to do our predictions show. It might look a bit sluggish, but trust me, it will be a lot more sluggish if they weren't putting in some of the work that they do put in the off season. So there's not really a full blown off season. Some players take a couple of days, maybe a week, and really switch off, and then they slowly start to ramp up again. I know a couple of players prefer it that way to really get football off of their minds and then go again. A lot of players, Mo Salah, for example, he just trains throughout, but that's just the nature of the beast. That's who he is. That's who he's always been as a person and as an athlete, right? So looking at the rest of preseason, there are a couple of teams that I want to pick out. There are a couple of teams that I enjoy their preseasons. There's a couple of teams that I didn't enjoy their preseasons. And when we talk about preseason, obviously, I want to bleed into that a bit of the transfer business that's been done by these teams, because I think that plays a huge factor, again, especially in the World Cup year. And in terms of winners and losers, for me, the biggest winner in preseason, despite obviously an injury to a Minter and a Believer, which low-key could be a win, and I'll give you the argument for that being a win, even though they're injuries in a second. I'm bearing the lead here. It's Brighton, right? It's Brighton. They didn't just win games, in my opinion. I thought they were controlling games at a level that I would have expected a bit further down in the season. So that bodes well for them for the start of the season. I think they had that 4-1 win against Wycombe. Then they played Strasbourg. I think that one was, yes, it was 4-3, but I still do think there was a level of control that I was impressed with Brighton in that game, despite the high-scoring game that it was, right? And then it settled back down into that control mood when they played Roma. They beat them 3-0 and the 1-0 win against Bologna, right? So I think based on those performances that I was able to watch, I was very impressed with them. I think they're going to have a fast start to the season this year, and then hopefully they can carry on that momentum going forward. Obviously, with such a young manager, they're going to have ups and downs. We have to expect that from them. We have to allow managers to grow as well. They can't always be perfect. And young managers, like young players, are going to make mistakes. They're going to learn from them, hopefully, and they continue to grow and improve. So hopefully that happens for them as well. I think they got the steal of the transfer window in bringing in Vuskovic from Tottenham. He's such a talented centre-back. I don't understand why Tottenham had that switch of Van Hecke going to them and Vuskovic going to Brighton. I think Brighton definitely won in that one, but we will see whether or not that affects things for them. And I want to go back to what I was talking about slightly earlier, where I was talking about, yes, they had some injuries, but those could be wins. You look at Belieber, you look at Minter, two players that have been coveted by teams heading into this transfer window. Inquiries had been made by teams heading into this transfer window. Last season, Belieber was a player that a lot of teams were trying to get. Brighton obviously were in a very good position from a contractual perspective, so they didn't feel a need to sell him. They set up a very aggressive price, and no team was able to match it. This season, they were more open to letting him go. It didn't transpire. He obviously has the injury, right? But he's not going to be injured for an extended period in the season. I believe he's going to be back, well before December, if not October. If I'm wrong, I'll get corrected in the chat. Do let me know. But I'm pretty sure he's going to be back around October. I'm pretty sure Minter's going to be back around that time as well. What that means is it allows Brighton, first and foremost, to not have to deal with just the constant rumors, the constant fake news, to use that term, but a lot of it is that comes with a transfer window. They don't have to entertain transfer bids, official bids. They don't have to worry about whether or not the player's head gets turned by certain clubs. They don't have to worry about whether or not when they do sell them, do we need to replace them? Do we have enough, in the squad? All of that goes out the window with the injuries. They get those players back in October, which obviously you can't win the league in the first couple of games. You can certainly lose it, but you can't win the league in the first couple of games, similar to any aspiration that you might have as a team. You can't, for example, you can't get relegated at the beginning of the season, but you certainly can go a long way to getting there, right? You can't get into European football at the beginning of the season, but you can certainly rule yourself out of contention for European football. So you do have those things that you need to take into account. You do have those things that you have to factor in if you are a team like Brighton. So those players get to come back in October. You get to use them for pretty much majority of the season. They potentially are playing for moves. So they're going to be willing to, I think, in my opinion, be more open to playing wholeheartedly for the team, opposed to if, for example, they go the whole transfer window, bids come in, Brighton reject them, and the player gets despondent and no longer wants to be at the club, or no longer feels like no longer feels like, their heart is set on playing for Brighton, or feel like the club held them back from their true aspirations and that type of thing. I don't think Brighton have to worry about that, because it wasn't going to be able to happen anywhere because of their injuries. So I think that bodes really well for them. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, to me, Brighton continue to be the smartest team in world football, in European football. I like the blend in players that they've been bringing in. You see a James Milner come in, for example, coupled with all the young players that they do bring in, because you need to have that balance. You need to have, for example, a Robertson to show people how things are done. You need a James Milner to show people how it's done. For Brighton, from Brighton's perspective, you need a Struijk to come in at centre back and teach a Vuskovic about what it's like to be in the Premier League, how to carry yourself, different experiences that he's experienced playing at the different levels in the Premier League can only help in those situations. And Brighton seem to balance that out quite well. They'll have some of the experienced players, and they'll have these young, vibrant players that can spark things and can have really exciting purple patches alongside the consistency of these older players. I think I haven't experienced a club yet that that has been able to blend it so well with the perceived status of that club, the way that Brighton have. And as I say, I think they continue to be the smartest team in the room. And a team that's also similar to Brighton, they also start with a B. They're also a very smart team, is Brentford. I enjoyed their preseason. I think Brentford, slightly more than Brighton, are a very schematic team. They are very much this is who we are, this is our blueprint, and this is how we're going to go about it, irrespective of who comes into the club, who leaves the club, who we buy, who we sell. Everything seems to go through probably a more data-driven model than necessarily a data-informed model, right? And there is that difference between the two. Data-driven, you are relying on the data and you're going with it and you're trusting in it. If, data-informed, obviously you've got the data to support as a factor all the other things that you're taking on board, and you can be on that spectrum. You can slide between, you can slot yourself where you want to slot yourself in that spectrum. I prefer to lean more towards data informed than purely data driven, because I think there is situations where context does matter, and we do need to play that into consideration. Obviously, Neil mentioned Sangare, one of the signings that they were able to make in Brentford. A phenomenal signing, 48 million euros, I think is a great signing for him, is a great fee for him. I think it's an important move for him because they were clubs maybe higher up the league table, not to be disrespectful to Brentford, that were eyeing Sangara, that had inquired for Sangara, that had those tentative talks about, okay, what does the structure of this deal look like? And Brentford end up getting him. It allows him to go to a team where he can become a guaranteed starter, play all 38 games or very close to it in the Premier League and gain that experience that I don't think he would have gotten, for example, if he goes to a Liverpool, one of the clubs that lightly, inquired about him. Going to a Brentford, I think, is a great situation for him. It's a brilliant platform. He gets to play in a system team, a schematic team that is the greater sum of its parts, right? So it's going to be a great advertisement for him. So I think, Neil, you're spot on there. I do think it's a great signing for Brentford. And then you look at what they were doing in pre-season. This is a team that was scoring goals left, right, and center. None more than in that impressive game against Eintracht Frankfurt. They went and beat them 7-0. And I'm sitting back and I'm thinking, hang on. Are they a team that we all need to pay close attention to? We saw how close they came to, magical things last season in the Premier League. Obviously, this season, they want to go one better. They want to push themselves, over the line this time around. I think they are, I don't know if we can call them a dark horse because of how well they did last season, but I certainly think they are going to be one of the teams contending for European football next season. I think they've just gotten better and better. You look at the players that they've lost in the transfer window. I don't think it's necessarily players that they desperately wanted to keep. I think every single one of those players that were let go by them or that, left the club were by Brentford's choice. I don't think anyone forced their way out of there. Whereas if you look in the past seasons, they'll lose an Ivan Toney. They'll lose an Mbeumo. They'll lose a Wissa. You know what I mean? And then they have to constantly replace them. Whereas this season, they're able to add to the Thiagos. They're able to add to the Dango Ataras. They're able to add to all of these guys, the Jan Alt and all of these guys that have played so well for them last season. And they get to platform that and go from strength to strength. And when you look at how chaotic the Premier League is this season, when you look at the inconsistencies we're going to see with the amount of new managers coming in, this is a team, as I said, the system stays the same. They have, yes, a manager that's had 1 year under his belt, but a very successful first year. So he's got plenty of consistency going for him this season. I think they're going to sneak in to a European spot this season. And that means someone's going to be very disappointed from maybe one of the traditionally big six clubs, and then you add some of the other clubs that usually flirt in and around that position. Right. A team that I think is flirting with being a winner this offseason, and I think it's largely due to the manager that they brought in, and that's Chelsea. Because Xavi Alonso comes in, he was quite demanding with what he needed and wanted in order to sign for whatever club he was going to sign for. And there were some clubs that were not willing to give him that. Chelsea were willing to give him that. And I think what he brings to this Chelsea team is a grown-up in the room. Because Chelsea, we've seen them season after season in this Ted Bowley era play or treat the club like it is a Football Manager save, where you're just signing all the wonder kids, throwing them out there and hoping that it's going to work out, right? There's got to be a bit more balance. There's got to be a bit more intentionality to how you build a squad. And Chelsea have not been able to do that. I've mentioned it time and time again on this podcast, how that affects your ability to contend in a league. If you want to talk about cup competitions, I think that there are other factors that come into it, including momentum, including who you play and all those kind of things. In the league, you have to have a level of consistency. And when you sign so many young players, they are not going to be consistent. And the only hope you have is that those players' purple patches all match up at the same time, and the chances of that happening, right, are very, very difficult. So that's been the challenge for them. He seemed to come in. Obviously, we've seen some of the experienced players he's brought in. Maybe he's gone to the extreme end with some of the experienced players he's brought in, with a Welbeck and a Jordan Henderson, who are probably in the last years of their careers, right? But I think he's trying to address this imbalance in the squad from an age perspective, from an experience perspective, from a know-how perspective. And for Chelsea's sake, you have to hope that he's able to be that mature person in the room and channel things in a way that can direct Chelsea to become the club that they were in previous seasons, a more successful club from that perspective. I do think he is a manager that I am upset he's gone to a team like Chelsea, because I rate him quite highly. Despite what happened to him at Real Madrid, there are stories behind the scenes with regards to that. Maybe we'll dive into that another episode. I mentioned it in a previous podcast before, what happened to him at Real Madrid, but in a future episode we can talk about it again, maybe at length, and I can talk you guys through the situation that he was in at Real Madrid, which was not ideal, and obviously led to an unsuccessful tenure for him there. But for Chelsea, the fact that I'm upset that they got him as a manager should give you guys hope, if you're a Chelsea fan, that this is a good signing for us, and we're going to do good things. Let's move on to the clubs that I think fall into the loser category for this preseason, that I've not been too impressed with them in preseason. I think there are questions to be asked. I think there's maybe some regressing back to the mean for them. Aston Villa has to be one of them. They won 3 of their 8 games in preseason, and there is a battle that they're having at the moment of, they've got very ambitious owners and they're trying to be ambitious, but we know the financial restrictions that the Premier League has. And what Aston Villa have done is, I think they've effectively, I'm not literally saying they did this, but effectively they've borrowed from the future to try and build the present, and that bill is coming due over the next couple of seasons. I don't think they're going to be able to sustain what they did in the past couple of seasons heading into the next couple of seasons, and we're going to see a kind of situation like Newcastle, where they're going to have to go through another transition phase, and that would be disappointing. Obviously, if you're an Aston Villa fan, that would be frustrating if you're an Aston Villa player. And unfortunately for an Unai Emery, who has aspirations as big as they come, right, he would be disappointed with a situation like that. So hopefully, for their sake, they're able to address that, they're able to fix it, they're able to persevere through this period, which I think is going to be a tough season for them this season. I don't think they're going to be a team that makes European football. Obviously, they've got Champions League football this season, and that's why the degree of difficulty for me has gone up in terms of trying to get back into Europe next season through the Premier League. Because for a lot of these players, they are not used to playing Champions League football. For a lot of these players, they're going to be making their debuts in the Champions League this season. And what we've seen with a lot of these players, when you have a squad with a lot of these players, is the concentration levels, the effort levels, the attention to detail in the games leading up to those Champions League games, or directly after those Champions League games. So I'm thinking maybe, the weekend before you play a Real Madrid at the Santiago Bernabeu. Are those players going to be going 100% in that league game if it's an away game to Coventry? I don't know. Those are questions that need to be answered for me. At this present point in time, I'm going to have to go with the assumption that they're not going to be able to handle those situations, and it's going to result in some poor results, a lot of dropped points in situations where they should have been picking up points. So I think, chat and everyone, That's something to keep an eye on. What are Aston Villa's results before Champions League games and after Champions League games? And how does that affect their season going forward? I think that's going to be a huge factor for them from a negative perspective, and it's going to see them struggle this season. Another team that I think is going to struggle this season, and I don't think it's a surprise for many, and that's one of the other losers from this preseason, that's Newcastle. It starts, and it's largely due to the amount of important players they've lost. The impact that Anthony Gordon had on the team, I think, is massive in terms of how they wanted to play. Obviously, they've got a new manager coming in, and that's another factor, right? Losing your manager just before you head off to preseason camp is not ideal. If Eddie Howe was not going to be here, ideally you want him to leave before, after the season ends. He goes, new manager comes in, give him a couple of months to settle, and then prepare for the season ahead. That's not the case for them, unfortunately. So you lose an Anthony Gordon. That's a gut punch. You lose a Bruno Guimaraes, you lose a Sandro Tonali. Those two were part of a very physical, aggressive midfield trio that caused Premier League teams problems left, right, and center. That, I think, is the big issue for Newcastle. Is I don't know if they're going to have as much steel in midfield. Obviously, Joe Linton is injured at this present point in time. I don't know if their midfield is going to be as strong, or at least replicate anywhere near to the level of performances that they were getting from that trio that we saw from them in recent seasons. And that, to me, was the bedrock of Newcastle in past seasons. Obviously, it helps in the sense that there's a new manager that's going to come in with new ideas that necessarily won't know what he's missing, kind of, with regards to that midfield, right? But they have to admit they're in a transition season, and a lot of it is Newcastle's fault. You look at the promises that they made to players when they signed them, and the inability, one reason or another, to keep to those promises leads to an Isak leaving. When Isak left, I mentioned the fact that this was him leaving, and the way he left was more damaging to Newcastle than if they had let him go in a more mutually beneficial way early in the transfer window, because what it did was it opened the eyes for some of the other players, the Bruno Guimaraes of the world, the Sandro Tonali's of the world that have eventually left, and Anthony Gordon, for example. And there are other players still in the squad right now that feel the same way, that were promised where Newcastle was going, and Newcastle haven't been able to sustain that. Again, the financial limitations that come with the Premier League and how the Premier League is being governed now, it means Newcastle can't do as much as they thought they were going to be able to do. And that's left a lot of disgruntled players in their team, a lot of disgruntled players in their organization, and they're going to have to clear out and kind of start again in order for them to be able to regroup, let's call it that. I think those are pretty much the teams that I wanted to focus on in terms of preseason. There are others. You look at an Arsenal, for example, who didn't do well in preseason and then go and absolutely destroy Man City in the Community Shield. It's just another reminder that, yes, preseason games, don't look too closely necessarily at the results. I prefer to look at the performances rather than the actual results in preseason games. And that's where my judgment comes from, because you can lose a 2-0 game in preseason, but you can see patterns of play that are going to be effective in the season, and that's going to help you out. And in those situations, I'm okay losing 2-0. It's still preseason from that perspective. But there's situations where the performances are not good, the results are not good, and it becomes a serious problem. But I want to end with this topic, which is obviously you look at the amount of money that has been spent throughout the Premier League this season. And a lot of people are talking about the fact that, there's a lot of money. Is why is the Premier League spending this much money? Every single sport goes through this moment where the money stops being kind of about the numbers and it starts being about the messages that are being sent with each transfer. I think the Premier League hit this point in time a couple of years ago. And I think they're now living in the aftermath of that. And it's just a snowball effect that is going to continue to grow and grow and grow. Because here's the thing that nobody's really admitting, and I'm surprised that it's not a major talking point with mainstream media, and maybe it's not a popular talking point with mainstream media. And that's the fact that you look at the transfer market, it didn't suddenly get crazy, which is kind of the perception they're giving us that, all of a sudden, the transfer market's gone crazy. I don't see it like that. To me, it's not like the Premier League has lost the plot all of a sudden. It's not like, to me, it's, if anything, the plot's gotten bigger, right? The money that's coming in has gotten bigger. The revenue from the Premier League has gotten bigger. So relative to the revenue that was being brought in previous years, are the transfer fees really that high? Yes, we'll all cringe at, your club, or it's usually more another team paying 100 odd million for a certain player that we might not fancy. And we compare that to, a Zinedine Zidane was only bought for X amount of money, or Virgil van Dijk in his prime was only bought for an X amount of money. Okay, fair enough. But how much money was the league making? How much buying power did Premier League's teams have at that point in time when those transfers were happening? And you look at the biggest transfers in Premier League history. I have to go all the way back to 1996. It has to be Alan Shearer. 1996, you're paying 15 million for Alan Shearer, and Kieran Maguire. He's obviously phenomenal with his football finances that he dives into. And he brought this up as well with his transfer index in terms of the inflation, in terms of buying power specifically within Premier League clubs. He equates that 15 million Alan Shearer transfer to about 223 odd million pounds in today's money. So let's wind these things back in terms of people complaining about transfers. And I get it. I do get it. I do appreciate that it feels like an awful lot of money. It's a lot of money that many, many people will never see in their lifetime, even if you add their children and grandchildren's lifetimes, right? I appreciate that. But the biggest transfer from a buying power perspective is not a Grealish. It's not a Rice. It's not a Caicedo or an Enzo. It's not even the Morgan Rogers fee that he's gone for recently. It's that Alan Shearer 15 million in 1996, if that's equating to 200 odd million in today's market. And you have to take that into account. You have to take into account the fact that this is the going rate now for players. Because the Premier League has that much money, you have to look at the people that own these Premier League clubs and the amount of money they have and they're willing to spend. If the Premier League didn't have these financial restrictions, we would have blown past 200 million way before this year. The Premier League regulations are actually holding these clubs back in terms of how much they can spend on players. I don't think we're far off a 200 million pound player coming into the Premier League at some point in time, or perhaps being bought by a PSG or the likes. The money is there. The biggest evidence of the fact that the money is there is go look at, obviously, Liverpool. They've got minority owners coming in. They've got an option to buy the club in 12 months. I would be very surprised if they don't go on to eventually become the majority owners of Liverpool. If they're coming into Liverpool, a club who FSG bought for about 300 odd million pounds, right? For less than 3 Morgan Rogers, when they bought the club, then they thought this is an undervalued asset that we can grow. They've grown it into a multi-billion-dollar club, right? Multi-billion-pound club, sorry. And yet there's still people willing to buy Liverpool. And you look at the type of people that are buying Liverpool. These are people that buy things to make money. They don't just buy things for the love of the game. So they still think there's more to, to get from a Liverpool. They still think there's more value to add to a Liverpool Football Club. That tells me that these transfer fees are going to keep going up, because clearly they know something in terms of how much more revenue is going to come in for these clubs that they are going to be able to capitalize on. So don't you worry. We are not stopping from a Premier League perspective in terms of transfer fees, in terms of wages that these players are going to be paid. And it might annoy a lot of people. I get that. It might not annoy some people. I get that too. But I do think it is an inevitability, and we're going to have to deal with that. So in terms of this podcast, that is going to do it for another episode of A Tad Predictable. I do want to implore you all to go wrap your EPL fix at EPLindex.com from everything from match previews and post-match breakdowns to player ratings, the latest transfer buzz, and check out It Was Always Football, which is the EPL Index Substack for deeper tactical writing and that kind of long-form analysis, which is really, really insightful and helps you further learn about the game, and as is our ethos here at EPL Index. Also tune in to the daily show, the Two-Footed Podcast with Dave Hendrick, where he dissects the hottest topics in football. Then on Sunday evenings, as the Premier League now starts again this weekend, go and catch the final whistle with Nina and Ben. They're going to be recapping the weekend's action every single week. We've also added some brand new shows to the network, including Goal Difference with Lola and Scarlett. Lola and Scarlett are twins, and one supports Liverpool, one supports Arsenal. They were the show that comes on just before my show. So every Monday at 8 p.m. And then we come on every Monday at 10 p.m. And it was a fascinating show, them breaking down, their thoughts on where Arsenal are, where Liverpool are heading into this transfer window. That was their last show. Definitely go check them out. Go like, go subscribe to EPLindex.com. Go and like their show. Come like this show as well. If you're on YouTube, write some comments. Talk. If you've got topics that you want me to talk about, let me know in the comments section. I'll assess those and add those into the shows as well. I think also in terms of following this show, there's going to be every weekday morning, you can wake up with Dave Davis. He's going to have a news round show where you're going to be able to catch up on everything that you may have missed overnight regarding the English Premier League. That goes from transfer rumors to, contract signings, potentially new managers joining teams, because that seems to be what everyone just does nowadays. So definitely go and do that. Follow this show on the Twitter and Blue Sky at A Tad Predictable, and keep up with at EPL Index for real-time updates. Make sure you subscribe to the EPL Index YouTube channel and hit that bell for notifications so you never miss a show. If you prefer the audio version, subscribe to the EPL Index podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and drop a positive review. It really helps us out, and we appreciate each and every one of you that has done it so far. I've been Tadiwa Chinikera. You can find me on my Twitter handle at Tad Predicts, which is also my Blue Sky handle. A huge thank you to Obi Semenya. He's at John Empire SA, and Jody, she's at Spursy141 for our podcast intro. Our producer behind the glass today, Mr. Ben Pescott. He's at Ben Pescott _ on Twitter. And remember, Chisingaperi, Chinoshura.
Tottenham are safe. Spurs stay up. Oh, Reed! Where on earth did he find that one from?
Forward through for Krupi. Chance here!
Salah for Liverpool. And there finally is the goal. Arsenal have won this game. Gabriel's header.
In 2026, the champions are the Arsenal.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, EPL Index proudly brings to you the best prediction podcast in the world, A Tad Predictable. Your host, Tadiwa Chanakira.